On June 21, 1919, 74 German warships sat at anchor in Scapa Flow, waiting for diplomats in France to decide their fate. At 10:00 a.m., a single coded signal went out from the flagship. Within 2 hours, 52 of those ships were on the bottom, scuttled by their own crews, while British guards scrambled to stop them. SMS Karlsruhe went down in 25 meters of water, and for 106 years, she's been sitting there with questions the official reports never answered. SMS Karlsruhe was built in 1916 as a Königsberg-class light cruiser, designed for a kind of warfare Germany was already losing by the time she entered service. She was laid down at the Kaiserliche Werft in Kiel in January 1916, while the Battle of Jutland was still being analyzed, and while the Kaiser's naval staff was realizing that big battleships weren't winning the war. The Königsberg class was Germany's attempt to maintain naval pressure with smaller, cheaper vessels, fast enough to escape, armed enough to threaten convoys and escorts, economical enough to build while the economy buckled under British blockade. Karlsruhe displaced approximately 5,440 tons fully loaded. Her turbines, built by AG Vulcan, could push her to 27 knots, fast for a light cruiser, but not exceptional. She carried 8 15-centimeter SKL-45 guns mounted individually in casemates and deck positions, not in turrets. Her armor was minimal. 50 meters at the belt, enough to stop shell splinters and small caliber fire, nothing more. She carried 2 single 500mm torpedo tubes and a crew of approximately 475 men. When she commissioned in November 1916, the strategic situation had already shifted. The German high seas fleet was bottled up in port. The great surface battles were over. What remained was convoy warfare, mine-laying, and the occasional sortie that ended in retreat. Karlsruhe spent the war in the Baltic and North Sea. In October 1917, she supported Operation Albion, the German assault on Estonia's Moonsund archipelago, where German forces seized islands from Russian defenders. Her guns bombarded coastal fortifications on Ösel Island while landing troops went ashore. It was effective work, but secondary theater work, far from the decisive naval engagements Germany had planned for. When the armistice came in November 1918, she was ordered to Scapa Flow with the rest of the high seas fleet. 74 ships arrived in late November under full Allied escort and were anchored in the cold waters of the Orkney Islands, while diplomats in Versailles negotiated the peace. The terms were clear: internment pending final disposition, no hostile action, complete disarmament. Allied inspection teams came aboard in December. They cataloged weapons, verified crew numbers, examined machinery. The reports were routine. Everything appeared in order. But internment wasn't surrender, not legally. Rear Admiral Ludwig von Reuter, the ranking German officer at Scapa Flow, understood this. The ships remained German property under international maritime law. Internment was temporary, a holding status until the treaty was finalized. Von Reuter read the armistice terms carefully. He consulted with his officers, and he quietly maintained operational readiness where he could within the limits British inspectors allowed. The crews continued daily routines, musters, watch rotations, equipment maintenance. It looked like discipline for morale's sake, the kind of thing a professional Navy does even in defeat. British inspectors saw no threat. They were managing 74 ships and thousands of sailors. They checked what they needed to check and left. But there was an unresolved tension underneath the bureaucratic calm. The armistice had been extended multiple times through early 1919, while treaty negotiations dragged on. Each extension came with rumors that the next would be the last, that the Allies would finally seize the fleet. Von Reuter and his officers watched the newspapers. British papers were allowed in the camps and waited. They knew the Treaty of Versailles would transfer the ships to Britain and France as war reparations. They knew their navy would cease to exist, and they had contingency plans. What those plans actually were, and whether they extended beyond simple scuttling, depends on which records you trust and which ones still exist. On June 21, 1919, von Reuter believed he was out of time. The armistice had been extended repeatedly, but von Reuter's information, based on outdated newspapers, suggested the latest extension would expire on June 21st. He believed that once it expired, the Allies would immediately seize the fleet. The Treaty of Versailles was being finalized in France. He knew it was only days from being signed. It would actually be signed on June 28th, a week later. He also knew something else. The British Guard fleet had sailed out for exercises that morning, leaving Scapa Flow with minimal protection. Only a few destroyers and auxiliary vessels remained. Whether the timing was coincidental or the British had deliberately reduced their presence, assuming the treaty signing would formalize the transfer, remains unclear. At 10 a.m., von Reuter issued a coded signal to all intern ships. Paragraph 11. Confirm. It was the prearranged scuttling order, a contingency plan the officers had discussed quietly for months. The response was immediate and coordinated. German sailors across the anchorage began opening seacocks, smashing condenser pipes, flooding compartments. The goal was to sink the ships after crews had disembarked, minimizing casualties while ensuring the vessels went down too quickly for British intervention. On Karlsruhe, the crew worked methodically. Engineers opened the main seacocks, large bronze valves that admitted thousands of gallons per minute once turned. Damage control teams broke open auxiliary piping to accelerate flooding. Deck crews prepared lifeboats. British destroyers, realizing what was happening, raced back to the anchorage. Some tried to take sinking ships under tow. Others opened fire, warning shots at first. Then machine gun fire aimed at the water around German lifeboats, trying to intimidate crews into stopping the scuttling. 9 German sailors were killed in the chaos, shot or drowned. 52 ships went to the bottom. The British managed to beach 22 others before they sank completely, but the rest settled in the cold water of Scapa Flow. Karlsruhe went down in 25 meters, her superstructure submerged, her casemate guns tilted at odd angles. British officers were furious. Von Reuter and 1,800 of his men were imprisoned temporarily. Diplomatic protests followed. The British called it sabotage, a violation of the armistice. The Germans called it preservation of honor. The official version is straightforward. Von Reuter scuttled the fleet to prevent its transfer to the Allies. It was an act of defiance, calculated, deliberate, and final. His own post-war writings describe it as a painful but necessary decision, made in the moment when he realized the armistice was expiring and no reprieve was coming. The German Admiralty later distanced itself, claiming ignorance to avoid reparations penalties. Historians have generally accepted this account, a defeated navy choosing suicide over surrender, a symbolic end to the Kaiser's dreams of naval dominance. But there are gaps in the narrative that have never been fully explained. Why did von Reuter choose June 21st specifically, when the treaty wasn't scheduled to be signed until later? His explanation, that he believed the armistice would expire, is based on outdated newspapers, but he had access to more current information through British authorities. Why were the British Guard ships conveniently absent that morning? Some historians suggest it was coincidental, others that British commanders were complacent, assuming the treaty signing would formalize the transfer peacefully. And then there's the speed of the scuttling itself. 52 ships sank in under 2 hours. The coordination required, across dozens of vessels, with crews who'd been interned for 7 months, suggests extensive pre-planning. The British inspectors had verified the ships were disarmed and non-operational, yet the crews executed a complex operation with precision. Either the inspections were cursory, or the Germans had maintained capabilities the British didn't detect. The physical evidence, what remains on the seafloor, might clarify what the written records don't. But for decades, no one looked closely enough to ask the right questions. For most of the 20th century, Karlsruhe was just another wreck site, visited occasionally, documented minimally, largely forgotten. British salvage companies raised some of the smaller wrecks in the 1920s and 30s, selling the steel as scrap. The economics were brutal during the Depression. Lifting a 5,000-ton cruiser from 25 meters cost more than the metal was worth. Karlsruhe was listed in salvage company records as uneconomical, too deep, too damaged, too silted. She sat undisturbed through World War II, when Scapa Flow became a major British naval base again, and through the Cold War, slowly accumulating marine growth. Recreational divers found her in the 1970s during the early boom in UK wreck diving. Trip reports describe heavy silting, poor visibility, and limited artifacts. Most portable items had been taken by earlier salvage divers. The wreck became a known dive site, popular with technical divers, but not considered archaeologically significant beyond being another example of the Scapa Flow scuttling. Modern surveys using multi-beam sonar and ROV technology have been conducted on the Scapa Flow wrecks over the past 2 decades, including Karlsruhe. These surveys, undertaken by organizations including the University of the Highlands and Islands, Historic Environment Scotland, and various maritime archaeology groups, have produced detailed mapping of the site's current condition. What these surveys reveal is a wreck in relatively good structural condition for its age, with the hull largely intact, though heavily corroded and silted. The wreck lies on its side in 25 meters of water. The 8 15-cm gun positions remain visible, the barrels corroded but recognizable. The superstructure has collapsed in places. Interior spaces are filled with silt. The engineering spaces show the damage consistent with deliberate flooding, open seacocks, smashed piping, hatches left open. This matches the historical account of scuttling. But certain details don't align neatly with the narrative of a ship simply flooded and abandoned. The guns, for example, remain in their casemate positions rather than being dismounted and stored, which would have been standard procedure for a ship in long-term internment. The torpedo tubes, though corroded, show no evidence of having been rendered inoperable. The mechanisms, while frozen with age, appear intact rather than deliberately destroyed. Historic Environment Scotland surveys have documented the site primarily for preservation and management purposes, not for forensic historical investigation. The focus has been on monitoring structural stability, assessing dive safety, and preventing looting. Detailed examination of the ship's interior spaces, wireless rooms, officer quarters, storage areas has been limited by regulation, safety concerns, and the challenges of working in low-visibility, silt-filled environments. What hasn't been found is as interesting as what has. No comprehensive inventory of the ship's contents at the time of sinking exists in accessible archives. British inspection reports from December 1918 catalog armaments and major equipment, but not supplies, personal effects, or stored materials. German records from the internment period are fragmentary. Many were lost in the chaos of post-war Germany. Others were never transferred to central archives. This creates an evidence gap. We know Karlsruhe was inspected and declared disarmed. We know she sank quickly when scuttled. We know her wreck shows deliberate flooding damage. But the specifics of what was aboard, what the crew's actual readiness status was, and what, if any, contingency plans existed beyond scuttling, remain unclear because the documentary record is incomplete and the physical wreck has never been forensically examined with those questions in mind. The wreck is protected as a war grave and scheduled monument. Disturbance is prohibited, which means whatever answers might lie in the silt-filled compartments will likely stay there, unless the questions become important enough to justify the intrusion. Today, SMS Karlsruhe is legally protected, physically preserved, and historically ambiguous. The Protection of Military Remains Act 1986 designates the Scapa Flow wrecks as controlled sites. Diving requires permits from Historic Environment Scotland. artifact removal is prohibited. The site is monitored for environmental damage, anchor strikes, and unauthorized salvage. In 2019, the centennial of the scuttling joint German-British ceremonies were held on Orkney. Wreaths were laid. Speeches emphasized reconciliation. The event was respectful, diplomatic, and carefully framed to honor the dead without reopening political wounds. Descendants of the crews still visit. Some are interested in family history. Others have questions about what their relatives experienced during the internment. The archival record available to them is limited. German naval personnel files from the period are incomplete. Many were lost during World War II or in post-war administrative chaos. British records focus on inspections and logistics, not on individual German sailors. Freedom of information requests in both the UK and Germany have produced mixed results. Routine administrative documents, inspection logs, supply inventories, transfer orders are generally available, but some files remain classified or are listed as destroyed or missing. This isn't unusual for century-old military records. Wars, bombings, and bureaucratic neglect take their toll. But it does mean that certain questions about intelligence assessments of the interned fleet, about the specific capabilities the Germans retained, about whether British authorities suspected contingency plans beyond scuttling, can't be definitively answered from the documentary record alone. Von Reuter wrote about Scapa Flow after the war. His account, published in Germany in the early 1920s, presented the scuttling as an honorable act to prevent the fleet's humiliating transfer to the Allies. He described it as a decision made under pressure, in the moment, when he believed the armistice was expiring. His narrative became the standard German version of events and has been largely accepted by historians. But he wrote under post-war conditions, in a Germany facing reparations, occupation, and political instability. The account served a purpose. It framed the scuttling as defiance, not desperation. The problem with historical narratives is that they simplify. They turn complex events with multiple motivations and contingencies into clean stories with clear causes and effects. The scuttling becomes von Reuter's last act of defiance. The interned fleet becomes defeated sailors waiting for orders. The Allies become unprepared guards caught off balance. But complexity lives in the details that don't fit. Why did the scuttling happen so efficiently if the ships were truly disarmed and non-operational? How did crews coordinate across 74 vessels with minimal communication under British observation in a matter of hours? Why were certain ships, Karlsruhe among them, ready to sink so quickly when British attempts to tow or beach them failed? The physical evidence at the wreck sites suggests the ships retained more operational capability than the inspection reports indicate. Whether that was deliberate deception, British oversight, or simply the limitations of inspection regimes managing a massive fleet under improvised conditions, we don't know. The documentary record is incomplete. The survivors who could clarify are long dead, and the wrecks, which might hold physical answers, are protected from the kind of intrusive archaeology that could provide them. What remains is ambiguity, which is where memory and mythology grow. Families pass down stories. Grandfather said they were ready for something. Historians note discrepancies. The timeline doesn't quite match the official version. Divers report anomalies. We saw things that seemed odd, but we couldn't touch them to check. And the archives stay partially closed, not because of active conspiracy, but because bureaucratic inertia, classification protocols designed for different eras, and the simple fact that old records sometimes matter less to governments than to families and historians. What Karlsruhe's crew intended that morning, whether they were simply executing a scuttling order or preparing for something more, depends on evidence that's either gone, inaccessible, or sitting in the cold darkness of Scapa Flow, where no one's allowed to look. The watch may have stopped, but the questions haven't. 74 ships were interned at Scapa Flow. 52 went to the bottom. 22 were beached in time. But why those 22 survived and the others didn't? That's another story.